Good afternoon. I'm Daniel Olivas, and welcome to this wonderful Tia Chucha's book event. Today I have the honor and pleasure of interviewing the poet León Salvatierra, whose latest book is a book of poetry published by the University of Nevada Press titled To the North, Al Norte. It's a bilingual collection, and what we're going to do today is we'll have some questions and answers, but also we're going to get to hear Leon read several selections from his beautiful collection. But what I'd like to do first is tell you a little bit about Leon, if you don't know him already. Um, Leon migrated to the United States at age 15 from his home in Nicaragua to escape the fate of becoming a child soldier for the Sandinista regime. Arriving in the U.S. as an undocumented immigrant who knew very little English and suffering from an undiagnosed dyslexia, Leon had little reason to imagine that he would eventually not only earn a college degree, but also a Ph.D. in Hispanic Languages and Literatures from the University of California, Berkeley, and a Master's in Fine Arts in Poetry from the University of California, Davis. And in 2020, Leon won the Juana Goergen Poetry Prize and is currently teaching culture and literature courses in the Department of Chicana Studies at UC Davis. And now the University of Nevada Press brings us this absolutely gorgeous bilingual edition of his first poetry collection, To the North, Al Norte. With the vast majority of the poems translated by Javier Huerta, this collection is simultaneously heartbreaking and hilarious, a grand mix of poetic humanity that for some may be appreciated in the alternating rhythms and nuances of Spanish and English. With its publication, Salvatierra secures his position as a potent, inimitable, and eloquent poetic voice. Leon, before we begin with a few questions that I have for you, let's start with a poem that you've chosen to kick off our discussion.
Thank you, Daniel, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you to Tia Chucha's Centro Cultural for hosting me and inviting me to this space. I would like to also thank the people who are watching this event for being connected and attentive to this poetry conversation. I would like to start my reading, my conversation and the reading about Al Norte with a poem in Spanish. I'll read it in Spanish. It's titled Acto. So let me just, my reading glasses on. And Acto. Yo voy a decir lo que significa el amor. Mi abuelo decía que era el anhelo del yo por su otro yo, y desde entonces empecé a buscarte. Mi padre decía que el número del amor era el 7, porque 7 días tardó la creación, 7 días con sus noches haciéndose el amor. Yo te buscaba en cada 7 que cifraba mi vida, y te descubrí deslizándote a otros números. 1 se confunde con su otro yo cuando 2 cuerpos se entrelazan en la cama. 3 amores han habido en mi vida, 4 serán cuando te hayas ido. 5 días que no te aguanto, 6 besos en la paz Centro, 7 años de no encontrarte. Amor, enséñame del 1 al 1000 tus noches. ¿Cuál es tu filosofía del amor? Me preguntas en la cama y respondo, no es una flor, pero tal vez es un número. Toma, te lo regalo, escóndelo entre tus piernas, a la cuenta de 2, cuida que no se caiga. 1, ábrete sésamo. 2, amores han pisado tu reino.
What a beautiful poem. Before I ask you a question about the poem, I just want to remind our watchers, those folks who are watching online, if you have any questions, put your questions in the chat, and we can bring them into the conversation later on. When you write, well, did you say to yourself, "I'm going to write a love poem"? I mean, you know, it's almost a cliche that poets are going to write about love because that's like the greatest emotion that we can think of. And I know when I write poetry, I'm very careful to sometimes avoid talking about love because it can be a difficult subject.
Right.
And so can you talk about your approach to this poem and your decision to write it in this way?
Yeah, I decided to write a love poem because I think the most love poems that I've read from people who try to write love poems were bad love poems.
Yes.
In fact, I usually tell my students not to write love poems.
Right.
And I hope they don't read my poems because then they'll be like, oh, you lied, you write your love poem. But, you know, when I decided to write a love poem, I said, well, if I'm going to write a love poem, I'm going to try to do, you know, to write it differently, right? Mm-hmm. To play with the idea of love and to do something with it. And so I spent a lot of time in writing this poem, yeah, and trying to do something with language, with the rhythms, and with the allusions that the poem brings, with not just the idea of love, but also has this idea of you know, people in the past. Like I talk about my grandfather, right, my father. It's kind of like I thought about like how we look at literature, like as your elders, right? Like like you read poems from people who came before you, and you learn about literature in that way. So I thought about love, because in a way I feel like most poems are love poems, because in writing poetry, it's an act. That's why I titled it, it's an act. It's an act, but it could also be, it could allude to different things, the word act, right? But it's also an act in action, and something that you do, not that you right. You know, like the cliche ideas of love is also often flowery things and things that you say to make someone feel good, but at the end, what expresses love to its deepest sense, it takes place in an action. So it has to be acted out.
It's funny because I read the title differently. The word act or acto, it's sort of, I was thinking like a stage play in some ways, that we're playing these roles.
Well, I mean, the poems know more than the poets. You know, you write a poem and then people can read other things into it, but you never know what the poem does. You know,
and that's where the conversation is. The conversation, right. You know, being a writer is a very lonely thing. You know, until what you write goes out into the world, and then an audience starts to read it, and then they start telling you what they think it means.
No, and that's wonderful. I think one of the things that I love, I also love doing besides writing poetry, is teaching, because when I teaching poetry or literature, because when I teach, I feel like it's another way of, it's like an intensified version of reading, because when you read it like a poem, right, you read it on your own, you give it your own interpretation, or you experience it in a specific way according to your own experience. But when you are in a classroom full of students analyzing a poem or a short story, whatever, then you hear different interpretations, different perspectives from different people who bring into the text their own experience, and they analyze it differently, and that enriches the poem or the text itself. And so for me, teaching, I didn't mean to move into that topic of teaching, but because we're talking about reading and interpretation, for me, teaching is an intensified version of the experience of reading on your own. Yeah.
And sometimes students with me will say things like, they tell me what a story might mean that I wrote, and sometimes I'll say, no, I didn't mean that, but you know what? If you can support it in the text, then it's valid. And that's the beauty of a painting, that's the beauty of a poem, that's the beauty of a short story or novel. If you can support it and draw from it, that's fine, even if the artist didn't intend it.
Yeah, that's a great point, because we cannot go just to say, the poetry is totally subjective. At the end, you have to come up with an interpretation that makes some sense, right?
Right.
That has some evidence. If we're gonna talk, we're gonna say, okay, El Quijote, it's about a sack of potatoes.
Right.
Then then you have to show me how El Quijote a sack of potatoes, right? But
Right.
you have to have some proofs about when you make an assertion like that, and so we have to establish some limits, and of course you can have your own reading, but it has to make sense, right?
Right. It has to have. It's like the law.
Yeah.
You have to have support
Right.
you need evidentiary support. Now, this collection first appeared in Spanish in Nicaragua, correct?
Yeah, in 2012.
2012, and then Javier Huerta did most of the translations in this edition, and you did some of the translations. Can you tell our audience how this bilingual edition came to be?
Yeah, so Javier and I were roommates for about a decade when we were doing our graduate studies at UC Berkeley. And so, he was teaching a class in the English department in UC Berkeley on the literature of the undocumented. And when he wrote the title piece of Al Norte, he wrote it, and when he read it, he wanted to teach it, but the class that he was teaching his class in English. And so he wanted to teach it, and so he decided to translate that title piece, the poem, the prose poem. But in doing so, at some point he said, well, I'm just going to translate the entire collection. And one day he just sent me a Word document with a whole book translated. And we kind of sat on it for many years. We never actually tried to publish it or anything until when I decided, I should get an MFA in writing, and I applied to UC Davis. I got accepted, and as I started, because before I only wrote poetry in Spanish, but as I started writing poetry in English, I went back to the translation that Javier had made, and I looked at it and I said, you know what, let me reread the translation. And what I did, I took out 3 of the poems that I felt like didn't really work well with the book, and I replaced them with new poems that I wrote in Spanish. But then I said, well, now I'm writing poetry in English, so let me do the English translations myself. So those new editions, those 3 poems that I added to the new edition of Al Norte, I wrote them in Spanish to maintain the integrity of the spirit of the poem, of the book. and then I did the translations myself.
Mm.
And once I did that, when we started sending it out for possible publications, and that's how the book got picked up by University of Nevada Press. Luckily.
Wow. Wow. So from 2012 to
So it happened. I started sending it out in 2000. It's recently in 2021.
Okay.
So relatively recently, and it came out in 2022. So
right. So it came out 10 years after the Spanish edition.
it came out, 10 years, exactly 10 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
In a note to the reader in your book, you observe, my sense of being an imposter intensified when I entered illegally into the United States. I felt like an intruder. Close quote. And this feeling of not quite belonging is a theme that appears in many of your poems in the collection, such as in the poem, The Swearing of the Immigrant. Could you talk about the struggle of identity and belonging and how you approach the struggle through your poems?
Well, not just as a poet, but as any individual in society, I think that one of the most important things to have is to have an idea of who you are, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because having an idea of who you are gives you a sense of existing, a sense of like, well, I exist, I do all these things, this is who I am, this is, I play a role in society. And what happens with people who go in a country and they don't have the legal documents to reaffirm that presence in a place, it creates this feeling of uncertainty, this anxiety that you don't belong, because you don't have the documents to function just like any other person would function in that society. And that's just part of the experience of the immigrant, right? Of any immigrant who comes to the United States or to another country who doesn't have appropriate documents, right? Because we, as in any society, we are given documents from the moment we are born. We are given documents. We are given a birth certificate, all the way to, a driver's license. When you get married, you get a marriage certificate. You go through school, you get all kinds of documents that reaffirm your presence in that place. And without those documents, then you get this feeling that it creates a tremendous amount of anxiety, that it makes you doubt, and it creates a deep insecurity in being someone. And so that's just like being an immigrant, right? But I also think of in terms of being, when I started writing poetry, I thought, to be a poet, to be an author, you also have to have a deep understanding of who you are in order for you to create something of your own. And I think that's why in this collection, that's the first thing I tackle. The first thing I do, I start with my name, because starting with my name, it kind of like reaffirms the idea of I am someone. I'm not just someone in society, but I am someone in the world of letters. I'm gonna start explaining not just to the reader, but to myself who I am. And so I talk about how I start reading. I talk about the influence of Rubén Darío, and then I tie it to my own experience of my parents, and how that story plays out. But yeah, for me, and I think, to be honest, I think you can only, be free only through having a profound understanding of who you are, because then you know what you like and what you don't like. You know what kind of choices you can make And that's part of having an agency, right? But if you don't know who you are, if you don't have a solid understanding of who you are, then how can you make choices?
Right, right, and in many ways, this this collection is um, kind of points to the fact that not only are you trying to make sense of who you are
Right.
through the poems, but you're also making sense of who you are in two different countries,
Exactly.
Nicaragua and United States, and there are touchstones from both countries. So you are of both countries, and in some ways you're not of both countries. The famous phrase, ni de aquí, ni
Yeah,
de
yeah.
allá. Not always feeling totally at home, and that kind of, and particularly within the United States, where the undocumented immigrant is considered an illegal person.
Hmm.
That your very sense of who you are is illegal.
Right.
Yet at the same time, your homeland is too violent to remain in. So even though you are legal in that country you're not safe.
Yeah, and it's passed so many years now that even if I go back to my own country,
Right.
then I am not the same person I was when
Right.
I left,
Right.
and so many things have many things have been lost.
Right.
And so
Right.
when you go, the experience of being there, it makes you think, well, there's something missing here that makes me feel like I'm not from here anymore. I am from here, but it just feels like you feel
Right.
foreign.
You're the American.
Yeah, you are the American.
Right, when you
Right, yeah,
visit, it's
exactly.
pocho, whatever
Yeah.
they'll say about you. Um, so speaking of of U.S. touchstones in your poetry, Santa Claus appears in a couple of your
Yeah.
poems, in Santa's Diet and in Christmas News. Um, let's have you read those poems, beginning with Santa's Diet. That's at page 79, and then you can read
Okay.
Christmas News at 71, and then we can
Okay.
talk about them.
Um, Let me start reading the
Christmas News first.
Christmas News.
Okay.
And this poem, since
71.
71.
Mm-hmm.
President Clinton signs NACADA law. It says in the newspaper that I don't have to leave. Today, December 24th, 1999. In the United States of America, a space opens up. After 11 years, I am born again. NACADA law is the name of my new baptismal faith. The signature of a president has given legal form to my appearance. At last, I can telephone Nicaragua and say, Mama, they have signed my papers in Washington. I will be able to board a plane from Los Angeles, fly free among the clouds, and carry a big sack like Santa Claus.
Mm.
And so you want me to read
Read Santa's Diet. Yeah.
Santa's Diet, which is one of the new poems that I wrote,
Uh-huh.
and I translated myself, and it's dedicated to my son Dylan. Weeks Week after week, the boy kept lists of good behavior and accomplished chores, accumulating points in the system his father had designed. Carefully, with his red pencil, he added the total to his calendar. The boy had enough points and only one doubt. His apartment didn't have the warmth of a fireplace. He wondered if Santa could enter through his little window. He measured it with the ruler he used in math class, imagining Santa with his voluminous body sucking in his belly, concluding that if Santa could fit through chimneys, he would have no problem entering his apartment. Winter arrived at his home with the cold harshness of unemployment. But the boy rode to Santa with the cheerfulness of spring. He included his calendar of points and a wish list, asked for a bicycle, skates, video games, a cell phone, Beyblades, superhero toys, and even a laptop. Everything his friends had in this marvelous country. Christmas Eve came, and after dinner, he went to sit down by the window and slept there dreaming of Santa's beard. He woke up next to a package of Beyblades. His father told him, for sure Santa was so fat, he couldn't fit all the toys through the small window. The boy smiled and played with his Beyblades, thinking Santa was a fat old man who ate children's gifts.
So what's really fascinating to me, and this is the first time I thought about this, because hearing both those poems read together, I read them separately, as I read through the book. In the first one, Christmas News, you are, in a sense, the metaphorical Santa Claus.
Exactly.
Now that you have become documented and you can travel freely to your homeland, to your mom, bringing gifts like Santa Claus.
Exactly.
And then on the reverse side, in Santa's diet, it's your son's, desire to have this magical visit from this fat old dude with a beard who
Right.
will give him the blades, right? So he can roller skate, and your role is different. You're separate from Santa Claus, but you're not really, because you're the one who has to buy him.
Yeah.
So in many ways, you're still the Santa Claus. So, but why? Those are my observations. Why Santa Claus, and can you talk about these
Well,
poems?
in Nicaragua, we didn't have Santa Claus as when I was growing up. We had something, we called it El Niño Dios. And El Niño Dios is the one who brought whatever toys or gifts you would get on Christmas Day. And, when I came here, I was like, oh, there's no Niño Dios here, you know? It was all Santa Claus. And we saw the image of Santas everywhere. He was in even the coffee cups you buy in coffee places. And so this image of Santa was associated with this idea of buying stuff constantly. Everywhere I went, my first, I was thinking of my first Christmas that I spent in this country. That was a striking to me to see this image of this fat man everywhere. And so to me, that became associated with this experience of purchasing, buying stuff, buying anything during the Christmas time. So Santa Claus was, and nobody talked about El Niño Dios, and so I was thinking, oh, Santa Claus is a purchasing apparatus or a purchasing mode of buying gifts here. And so for me, that was an important observation that I made, that I later decided, well, I'm going to do something with that memory that I had when I first came. Because those ideas of Santa that I have in this book, they came from my first memories when I came to this country and experiencing the idea, the Santa phenomena. Because afterwards, I even enjoy Santa now. But like that first introduction to Santa was something that I remember clearly.
Yeah, it's you know, I grew up in the United States. My people have been here now for 100 years. So my grandparents came from Mexico around 1920, and so all of those cultural touchstones, you know, Santa Claus and all that, is what I grew up with. And we celebrated Halloween, and it wasn't until much later that the Los Muertos started being reintroduced. And when I was growing up in a predominantly Mexican American community in LA, um, no one wanted to do Dia de los Muertos because it was like kind of old fashioned and like
Right.
not American. So we you know, we did Halloween. Um, in the title poem, um, the narrator recounts um, a group of migrants, really harrowing and deadly for some, crossing into the United States under the guidance of a coyote, who you just described as a quiet man with rough features. Um, could you read a little bit from the poem To the North
Okay.
at page 51?
I'll read a fragment. In this piece, there's this character. His name is Don Eduardo, and it takes place. The poem. It takes place at the border between Mexico, Guatemala, and Mexico. Just as the group of migrants have crossed the Rio Sache, I think it's called, and between the border of Guatemala and Mexico, and then this Don Eduardo character, he collapses and has an epileptic attack. And I'm running the voice, the narrator is running with another character whose name is the nickname is El Venado, and this is the part that I'm gonna read when they find Don Eduardo having an epileptic attack on the road as they are running, you know, because the El Caballo Blanco, who was the coyote, had told them they had to run as soon as they crossed the river. They had to run, and they couldn't stop. Okay, so here it says nobody else knew what had happened to Don Eduardo. El Venado grabbed him by the legs because he was stronger, and Don Eduardo kicked uncontrollably as if he were still running. I tried to control his head, which was bleeding from pounding against several rocks on the ground. We held them like that for a long time. Everything came to a halt, even the convulsion that made his chest jump. It was a strange sensation. I had never seen anyone die, much less had anyone died in my hands. In that moment, I would have liked to trade places with El Venado, holding Don Eduardo's legs. Perhaps I would not have felt his death as much, but it was on me to hold his graying head, his skull, his mind, his forehead, his eyes, his eyelids, his eyelashes, his eye sockets, his eyebrows, his nose, his mouth, his twisted tongue, his jaw, his neck. All of it was extinguished in an instant. The white foam continued to spew from his mouth only by inertia, but Don Eduardo's soul had already crossed the border. I had seen something similar many years before in my hometown. A young woman that sold cheese on the sidewalk at the market. Her cheese tray had been knocked over because she had collapsed on top of it. and the cheese began to roll on the ground. Several people helped her. I was a child then and was frightened by the white spit that gushed from her mouth. All I could think of doing was running back home, but I didn't. I wanted to see what would happen to her. That's when I saw that some of the same people that were helping her were stealing her cheese.
Wow. This is a powerful piece. It's a prose poem, this piece. And in some ways, for me at least, it felt like a sort of a benediction over those who have who did not survive crossing over. And as you talked about, the different parts of Don Eduardo's, physical being, it almost felt like a giving of the last rites of the oils. It almost felt like that. And was this poem meant to be, bearing witness and giving benediction to those who have passed?
Yeah, yes and no. At first, when I thought of writing this poem, I thought, I just want to write a good poem about my own experience crossing the border.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember this character, these images that I had seen when I was crossing the border. I said to myself, I'm gonna write a poem about that. But I didn't, consciously intended it to be like a benediction for all the people who tried to cross the border, didn't make it.
Mm-hmm.
But when I realized that when I finished writing the poem, the first few drafts, then I realized it is a poem that is sort of like a benediction for the people. And then so I realized, okay, now I have this poem, now I'm gonna write a book. And the thing about this Don Eduardo character is that he reappears in several of the poems that I wrote in the book. And in the dedication page, I also dedicated, on top of dedicating to my family members, most of them that had passed, I also said, and for Don Eduardo, because Don Eduardo for me is this is a symbol. It's not a specific person. It's more of a symbol that encapsulates this experience of the people, not just people who didn't make it, but people who came as undocumented and experience the obstacles that are shown in the book. Right.
And in many ways, you've documented them.
Right.
You've basically made them immortal.
Hopefully.
on some level, by putting them into your poetry.
Right.
And that line about, he finally crosses over, it's a different passage,
Right.
but it's a passage that no one can prevent. And that happens to all of us. If there's a heaven, I don't think they look at our papers. We if we're there and we're ready to go in, and we don't go to the other place, and
Yeah.
then we go right in. And not surprisingly, of course, your collection talks quite a bit about the violence of a war-torn country. The reason why many people, yourself included, left. And there's a poem, At the Cemetery, which is kind of personifies this subject. I would love for you to read that. It's at page 13.
Oh yes,
it's
this is the first poem of the collection now, but it didn't used to be. It's because it's one of those new poems that I wrote, and I translated myself. So at the cemetery, In Nicaragua, shrubs grow in the winter with the breath of rattlesnakes. 2 decades of war, alcohol, and other grievances had overcrowded the neighborhood of the dead. I walked with my hands on my head, back and forth, trying to remember where my father's grave was. Lightning split headstones, strangers. Snoring came from below. There were no other visitors, just a squirrel jumping among the graves. A mother hen with her chicks pecking a dog turd. A pig biting the feet of marble angels at the entrance of a mausoleum reminded me of the excesses of the rich. I jumped over graves, careful not to step on the dead. I thought to question them, but dared not interrupt their sleep. As a child, I would often visit the cemetery. No one knew I went there. The need to see my father's name, the dates of his birth and death. I ran over graves, trampled plants and flowers, dodged the funeral wreaths of new neighbors. The dead, too, feel when you step on them. Once a dead man rose up angry. Who is making so much noise, disturbing this dream that smells of mud? He put his index finger over his mouth and sank back into the ground. Since then, I respect silence like a god. The last time I visited my father before I went north, I told him I didn't want to die in the war. He didn't reply, but I knew he was listening. Now I have more to tell him, that I'm older than he was when he died. My son knows him from pictures and asked what he was like. I didn't have children with different women, nor did I become an alcoholic. And while it's never been easy, I have renounced his inheritance.
The image of you walking with your hands on your head, not remembering where your father's grave is just stuck with me, and it's the sense of panic, um, almost a fear of forgetting those who have left us, um, even though you're in a place where everything's marked so that we remember where people are, that they're documented,
Right.
in a sense, that they existed. Um, Writing about a cemetery and a loved one is difficult. What prompted you to write this poem? And I think this is one of the newer ones, right?
Right. This is one of the 3 poems that I inserted
Mm-hmm.
in the new edition of El Norte. When I went, like I said in the poem, I used to go after my father passed, before I came
Mm-hmm.
to the U.S. I used to go and visit him
Mm-hmm.
at the
Mm-hmm.
cemetery. And when I came to the U.S. and was here for 11 years, and finally got back to Nicaragua, with my papers already, having my green card. One of the first things I did, I went back to see my father.
Mm-hmm.
And so every time I went back home afterwards, I would go back and see him at the cemetery. And I remember one time I went to see him. It was late in the afternoon, and I couldn't find his tombstone. I couldn't find it because it was getting dark and started raining.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and the thing is that Nicaragua, it's such an impoverished country that sometimes the headstones get stolen because they're made of metal, and the people can sell the metal for for a few bucks.
Mm-hmm.
So they get stolen. So I couldn't recognize where he was. And so I always wanted to write a poem about that experience, but that's the only thing that I remember from that memory. And so when I sat down, I came up with this poem. When I sat down, actually write the poem, I came up with it. But yeah, that's the background story.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. Yeah. I lost my father was called back in 2020, and he had wanted to be a writer, and no one published this Chicano writer in the 50s, and he just burned everything. And I find I talk to him quite a bit,
Right.
and it's something I think that it's you know, you're keeping people, your loved ones, in alive in a sense by continuing the conversation with them.
Yeah, and sometimes you don't have to be at the cemetery to
No.
talk to them,
No.
right? You can talk to them in your head, or even sometimes when you're alone. You can always say a phrase say a phrase to your father directed to him, or
Right.
whoever is the person that you missed.
Right. As we've seen, the poems in this collection are very personal, and all the poems have something of you. But one in particular actually has a title that has your name in it, and it's called "León Salvatierra was born the day they killed Somoza," and I really like that poem. Let's have you read it. It's at page 57. And then we can talk about it afterwards.
Okay.
57, I think.
León Salvatierra was born the day they killed Somoza. I was born the day they killed Somoza at 10:30 in the morning, like gunsmoke. The news spread through the streets of my barrio. I had been born with great gusto, so they named me Augusto. There were celebrations and toasts in my name. I was born the day they killed Somoza. My parents had already lost 5 children. I had lost 5 brothers, but I came out into the light healthy. Eyes, neither one inflamed. Arms, neither one fractured. 2 legs free of blemishes and sores. My small fingers, one by one, were complete. My fingernails intact. My skin red with wrinkles, but time knows that I was trapped in my mother's womb. I was born without crying, it's true. The umbilical cord was strangling me, but nothing was damaged. My fists and feet moved like fruit and tropical branches. My parents cried for me. They say one could see it in their faces. Well, I was happy news. I was born the day they killed Somoza.
So Somoza was assassinated by the Sandinistas, right?
Well, I think they were assassinated by some professional assassins that were hired
by the Sandinistas in 1980.
In 1980, yeah.
You were born, and he was basically part of a ruling dynasty, right? His father.
Yeah, they've been in his. It was a family dynasty of 3 dictators that started in 1930s, in the 1930s, all the way to 1979 when the Sandinista revolution took place in Nicaragua, and the last Somoza was toppled and eventually hunted down in Paraguay. In 1980, and so yeah.
So what was fascinating to me about this poem was the fact that none of this history about Somoza is really talked about he's not really talked about other than that one refrain
Yeah.
that repeats.
There's nothing about him, just that line.
There's nothing about him, just that line that repeats, and the rest is about your family, about you.
Yeah, about the birth of the speaker or the poem. Yeah.
Right. So and which, for me at least, there was a great irony in that, just because of the fact that with his assassination then brought a war-torn country that eventually led to you leaving the country, for safety in order to survive. Can you talk about how you came up with that? How you came up with?
Well, the idea happened in a there was this party where I was talking to people, and I asked someone their age. It was a lady, and you're not supposed to ask a lady their age. But I was I was still young, and I was a grad student, and I made a mistake, and people looked at me. Oh, you're not supposed to ask. And I said, to get out of that situation, I said, people shouldn't ask people's age based on the year. We should ask what was happening when you were born. And they were like, oh yeah, that sounds good. So I got out of it like with an idea, right? And so and that's when I said, for example, I could say, I was born the day they killed Somoza.
Yeah.
And there was this girl there, and she's like, you know what? That sounds like a beautiful verse. And so that night I went home and I wrote the poem. And that poem is one of the few poems that I've written that felt like I wrote it like in 15 minutes. And then in the revision process, I did some changes, but really minor changes. It's one of those poems that I think that my conscious or had been writing for a long time, and it didn't come out until that moment. It was just kind of waiting for that moment to take place. And so people often ask me, but you don't look like you were born when you were born Somoza. And they start asking me, were you really born when you, when Somoza? And I always say, Google me. And of course, doesn't show in Google. But the metaphor is not exactly the Somoza, or the being born the Somoza, because Somoza is not just that person. Somoza is a dictatorship. The birth of a new Nicaragua. It's what's happening here, right? It's the new hope, which we know what happened next. But at that moment, it's a new hope, right? Like every birth is, you have the hope that this is going to be different, and that was the idea of it.
I was born the year Fidel Castro came into power, 1959. So we got some dictators in our background, in our histories. In the introduction, the wonderful poet Francisco Aragon talks about you as being a welcome addition to a chorus of poets from the Central American diaspora, which is very high praise, because Francisco is a wonderful poet, and we have wonderful Central American poets. Can you talk a little bit about how you see yourself in that grouping of important poets?
Well, I realized that I'd recently been teaching a Central American poetry in the U.S. Class at UC Davis. I taught it for a second. I just finished teaching it the second time, and in that class, we read a lot of the work that from Central American writers or poets in the last 2 decades, more or less. And so I being familiar with this work in the past few years, right? I familiarizing myself, and a lot of them, what I've noticed is they either came here when they were really young, to the point that sometimes they don't really write in Spanish, or the Spanish is sort of like their second language, or they were born here. And so I find that it's my writing is a really, I mean, it is part of that experience, because many of them come from they were either part of that diaspora from the 1980s, right? They were really young, like young children, or they were born from people who came from in the 1980s. They were their parents had that historical cultural background. So many of those poets had been writing poetry about going back to El Salvador or Guatemala, or Honduras, and Nicaragua. Or well, I haven't read, but in my own poetry, I also write about, there's a poems up al regreso, upon returning, where I experience in at the cemetery. I talk about going back to Nicaragua to see my family, but it's the idea is going back to the origin, right? I always see this gesture of going back to it's like a universal theme in the Central American writing, is to look for your roots, to look for to find out where you come from, right? And I think, if I'm not mistaken, one of the few poems, or perhaps the only poets in the group of poets who wrote about that experience in Spanish from the United States, writing from the United States, going to Central America or to Nicaragua in Spanish, and I wrote this entire book in Spanish, and then it got translated. I think that's one of the features that makes this experience a little bit different from the Central American writers or poets who are writing here in English and going back and to kind of like find out what their roots are. Because when I came, I was already 15, or about to turn 16, only a few months shy of turning 16. So I already had an understanding of who, my identity as Nicaraguense, being, and so it was only natural for me to write the experience from here, being here in Spanish. But now, I see it how it is in dialogue with other experiences that had been published in recently, and of these other poets who were either came here very young or were born here, and they're writing about and so it's a nice complement, I think, to look at those different perspectives of the same phenomena, right? Of in thinking about this experience in Spanish.
Right. And it points to the great diversity of experiences coming basically from the same country in terms of the roots. But as you noted, you're someone who was born there and you left at 15. And then we have other poets who were born here, but their roots are there.
Right.
Right. Their parents came over and then had them. And that right there, that one generation creates a different poetic view.
Exactly.
Because it's different experiences.
Yes. Yeah. And that's a key difference. It's an important difference, I think. Just feeling like, okay, you have these experiences as a child here, something that I didn't have. Right. I came as a teenager.
Right.
Right. And so that difference is I think it's key in how my book kind of like enters into a dialogue with other writers from Central America here.
Do we have any questions?
Yes.
Okay.
I have a couple questions online. One of them was, did you struggle with translating any words into English?
So did you struggle translating any of the words into English?
For the three poems that I translated myself, I didn't really. I found the process pretty smooth, so it wasn't really difficult. It's translating is a difficult job.
Mm-hmm.
It's not easy, but I think at that point I felt like my skills were fine-tuned to the point that it wasn't really like a big struggle, but I did spend a lot of time working on those translations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Another question?
We have another person who just thought what you said was beautiful. When you said poems no more than the poet, they thought that was
Uh,
beautiful. And we have another question too that said, did you find any new meanings in your poems after you began to translate them?
Did you find any new meanings in your poems when you translated them?
I think the process of translating poetry, it's a way of learning, and when you translate uh, poems, you always find something new,
Mm-hmm.
and even without translating, when you read a poem and you read it again later on, you often find, if the poem is a good poem, you often find new meanings, a new form
Mm-hmm.
of interpreting the poem.
Mm-hmm.
But while you're translating a poem, because I've translated poems, not just my poems, but other people's poems, at first I read the poem and I have like an understanding or interpretation of the poem.
Mm-hmm.
But when I translate them, I find new things.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a wonderful practice
Mm-hmm.
to do translations,
Mm-hmm.
because you're always finding new ways of looking at the poems.
Right. I've always considered translation to be a separate art form
Yes.
because, believe me, I've read bad translations.
Yeah.
And then when you read a really good translation by someone who knows what they're doing and who is, themselves a poet or a fiction writer and can capture the spirit of the original, then you realize, yeah, this is a real talent. That
You know, I feel that whenever I'm faced with a good poem, with what I consider a great poem,
Mm-hmm.
it almost feels like these poems are translations, even if they're not.
Yeah.
Because what poetry does in a way, it translates an experience.
Mm-hmm.
It translates the moment you create a poem, or write a poem, it's a translation itself.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I read a great poem, it feels like a translation. When I remember, I felt like that when I read T.S. Eliot's the Love Song of Alfred Prufrock.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like I was reading a translation for some reason.
Huh.
And then later
Yeah.
I reflected on that idea. I said,
Mm-hmm.
well, that perhaps had to do with the fact that great poems are translating not from one language to another, but from a lived experience
Mm-hmm.
into the words.
Into words.
And so,
That's beautiful. What wonderful questions from the audience. That's great.
Mhm.
Any other questions or no?
Yes.
Oh.
Are all these experiences uniquely yours, or are they also interpreted from others too?
So are all these experiences in these poems yours, or are they based on other people's experiences?
no, these most of the poems here come from imagery that either from my memory, from my visions, or my dreams.
Mm.
And they might be interpretations of other people's experiences as well. And in that way, I think that most poems are autobiographical, but not because they talk about what happened in someone's life, and not just my poems. I think most poems are autobiographical.
Mm-hmm.
Or I think all poems, regardless of what they say, because someone writes them,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And they must write them from some lived experience or something that they themselves thought about, and that is part of their biography,
Mm-hmm.
right? But most of the poems here didn't necessarily are not trying to write about what happened to my life.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm trying to do is I grab imagery from my memory, my dreams, or my visions, and that's where I start to write a poem. And whatever happens in the writing process is what the poem becomes.
Mm-hmm.
So in this book the book is not articulating something that really is true to what my experience is articulating poetically imagery that comes from my memories, from my dreams, and from my visions.
Mm. I love that. Good questions. Excellent questions. Any other questions? Or
Yeah.
oh, is it more? Okay.
When you talk about learning about yourself, was there a specific poem that was the most difficult to write?
When you talk about learning about yourself through your writing of your poetry, was there any particular one that was really difficult to write?
I think the poem that it was difficult to write because I wanted to really dig into this idea of you know who I
Mm.
was the poem To the Reader,
Mm-hmm.
which is a prose poem,
Mm-hmm.
and I intentionally put it as the first piece of the book because I wanted it not just to explore who I was,
Mm-hmm.
but to also create kind of like an arts poetica of
Mm-hmm.
what my ideas of writing poetry looks like,
Mm-hmm.
tie in with my ideas of who I was.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You see, and that that gesture, that desire to do this, pushed me to really look into many in the tradition of literature, many poems that have been written in a similar gesture,
Mm-hmm.
and then when I read the traditions of this kind of poetry,
Mm-hmm.
I then the question was, well, how do I do it differently?
Mm.
And so that was a challenge. It was difficult, of
Yeah.
course. Like poetry is always difficult, but
Yeah.
that particular poem that was a really difficult poem to write. Yeah.
Good questions. Excellent questions.
Yeah, people are just loving what you're saying. They relate a lot to it. There was another question too, which was, um, what would be your advice to any aspiring writers who are just starting their journey?
Yeah, what would be your advice to any aspiring writers who's just beginning their journey?
For me, the key element for to have first when you start writing is to have your own voice. That is something that you have to have. And when you have your own voice, the other stuff you can learn along the way. But if you start learning the craft and you don't have your own voice, it's difficult. So to me, I go back to this idea: you gotta learn of who you are,
Mm-hmm.
because when you learn who you are, then your voice comes through in your writing.
Mm-hmm.
I think, and then you can, of course, writing is an art form,
Mm-hmm.
and you have to read not only what has been done before, but also what's been written now, and also read the context in which you live and read the rhythms of your life, and then take all of that to create your work. And so that requires a lot of work. But the first thing to do is to really have a deep understanding of who you are, have a solid idea of who it is who is that person looking at you in the mirror when you stand in front of it.
Mm-hmm. I would add to that, beautifully put, but what I would add to that also is, as you're doing that, don't let other people tell you that you shouldn't be telling your story or you shouldn't be writing, because there's only one person who can tell your story. And again, I think about my father, who destroyed all his writing and gave up on writing when he got rejected by publishers
Right.
in the 50s and 60s. He just, it breaks my heart when I think about how many voices out there, particularly writers who are underrepresented within the publishing world, are told, well, your stories are too ethnic, or your poetry is too. It's too much of a place, ignore that. Try to find communities that support you, and I think you
Yeah,
found your communities. You
yeah.
found,
No, that's really important to be able to find your own space, to find yourself, and to just to know the, that you have something to say. You have your own story, like you say. Yesterday, I think the day before yesterday, I went with my son to take him a passport because we're trying to a passport photo because we're trying to get him his passport renewed, and there was this sign that said that the inverted the Cartesian saying like I am therefore I think. It said,
Yeah.
the card said I think therefore I am.
Right.
And I started thinking about it in terms of poetry and knowing who you are first, right? Because that allows you to first who you are, and then you can say you start thinking about it, And sometimes I read poetry that you could see all that thinking, but you don't know who the voice is, and so the poems somewhat seem weak.
Like sterile.
Yes, sterile. It seems they seem like they don't have that force. And to me, when I talk about voice is that idea of having a really good sense of who you are, because then when you do have the sense of who you are, then your verses, the craft that you create, the thinking, let's say, it becomes even better, right? Instead of doing it the opposite way, where all the thinking comes through, but then like we don't know who this voice is,
Right.
right?
Right. Right. You see the intellect.
You see the intellect, you see everything, but the voice seems buried somewhere. It just seems like it's not there.
I think some writers are afraid to go there.
I'm not.
No, I know you're not, and that's the power of your poetry. Let's have you read one more poem.
Okay.
Attempt, which is at page 83.
Okay. Attempt. Moments I wish to remember. The first time I saw rain. The day my mother walked on the beach in Poneloya, carrying me in her hands. The gaze my grandfather, the gaze of my grandfather who died blind. Not the first day that I lost and cried, but yes, the first time I played and smiled. That time I dreamt that I saw my face in the water, the blood on my face. The first time I was afraid to jump and my feet got wet.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Beautiful way to end this fantastic visit with León Salvatierra, who is just a magnificent poet, and his collection To the North, Al Norte, published by University of Nevada Press. It's a beautiful bilingual edition. If you teach poetry out there, this is a perfect book to have in your classroom. get your students thinking, and also giving them some inspiration to do their own writing that reaches down into their souls. Um, I want to thank you very much for opening up to our audience, and I want to thank the Chuchas for once again being a wonderful platform for bringing culture and the arts to the community. Leon, thank you. It was a pleasure and a real honor.
It's been an honor to be here, a pleasure for me, and thank you to Tia Chucha for hosting me, and to you for doing this amazing interview. Thank you, Daniel.
You made
and the
it easy.
people who are watching us.
Yeah, thank you. Wonderful questions. Thank you, everybody. And it's a wrap.
Thank